Hello Internet! Now, since the video this week, or the primary video, whatever you want to call it, is about the Battle of Blenheim, which was a battle in the War of Spanish Succession, I thought I would also spend some time actually talking about the War of Spanish Succession, give a small sort of quick look guide into what the thing was actually about, because I feel like it's one of those wars that not too many people nowadays actually have heard of or even know what is. So, yeah, I'm just gonna really quickly give you the background of that particular conflict and why the Battle of Blenheim was so important. So, yeah, enjoy. The War of Spanish Succession was basically that, a war to determine who was going to be the king of Spain, who was going to succeed to the throne of Spain. It grew out of the uselessness and inbred invalidity of the last Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II. He had no offspring. In fact, he was probably very much incapable of having offspring, and the only thing that he really is notable for is that he managed to live almost to the year of 40, despite everyone in Europe had basically expected him to die for the last, 10, 15, 20 years. Absolutely senile, completely inbred. He was a terrible king. However, one thing he did was that he left his kingdom in his will to Philip of Anjou, who was the grandson of Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. This would have united the two. Oh, this would have united Spain with France, who at that time was the leading power in Europe, and left the French, well, completely dominant and completely untouchable on the continent. And since this was not very appealing to everyone else in Europe at the time, eventually another throne pretender, namely Charles of Austria, the brother of the then reigning Holy Roman Emperor, was put forward as a candidate for the throne of Spain. However, France, of course, wished to continue to push their candidacy, and eventually war erupted. Why was Spain so important? Well, Spain had about 100 years earlier been probably the primary power in Europe. It held a colossal colonial empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean in the Philippines all the way across to the Americas, where it held at this particular point most of North America and practically all of South and Central America except for Brazil. So it was a major, major power, even if its, shall we say, European influence had diminished with a certain degree of economical issues and military backwardism, if, well, you can put it like that. It was still, however, quite an important player in European politics that simply could not be ignored. This then combined with the fact that France, after the wars of religion in the late 16th century, had spent the last 100 years going from strength to strength to strength. Their opponents were all weakened. The Holy Roman Empire had been embroiled in a long and, to quite a bit of degree, losing battle with the Ottoman Empire, a conflict that was only finally reaching its turning point in 1683 with the siege of Vienna, after which, when the siege was broken, the imperial armies reconquered a good bit of the Balkans under their High General Prince Eugene of Savoy. England had been weakened by the civil war that cost Charles I his throne and, in fact, his head, and the restoration that came later. Then another semi-civil war that ended in the glorious revolution of 1688, when the Catholic James II was driven into exile and the Dutch stadtholder William of Orange became King of England. Part of France's great rise to power had been Louis XIV's wars against just that, the Dutch republics, wherein he, in several minor conflicts and wars, managed to conquer most of what is today Flanders and southern Belgium, that had in fact been part of the Spanish Netherlands and had belonged to Spain ever since the great days of Charles V in the mid-16th century. This had left the Dutch rather unsecure about their own position in Europe, since they feared France would eventually make an attack against them and overwhelm them. And the Dutch's primary strength were in their naval forces and indeed in their trade fleets, leading to them and Britain becoming known as the maritime powers, as that was where their particular strength lay. Of course, William in the Netherlands had been the primary antagonist, primary enemy of Louis XIV, and Louis did not particularly care for the fact that William had become King of England, and the War of Spanish Succession were in fact preceded by what is today known as the 9 Years' War, which was basically yet another conflict to try to curb the power of Louis XIV, while he tried to expand it on on the cost of his neighbors. And while Louis' power had been to a certain degree curtailed since his particular glory year of around 1683, where he reigned supreme in Europe, and it looked like that his allies in the Ottoman Empire might in fact succeed in overthrowing the Holy Roman Empire in Central Europe, we were still in a situation where France was basically a threat to everyone, and no one could really threaten it back in and of themselves. This was the background of 1700, the year 1700, when Charles II finally died. He, as I said in his will, gave his kingdom to one of Louis' grandsons. Of course, they were familiarly related, as practically every great kingdom or royal family was at the time. And this so worried the rest of the powers of Europe that France should gain access to, or through Philip, control of the Spanish Empire, particularly the Spanish colonial empire, with its huge resources in its plundering of the, gold and silver mines and the native population of South America, that the sort of Grand Alliance, as it was called from back in the 1680s, was revived. The maritime powers of Britain and England united with the Holy Roman Empire and several smaller realms throughout Europe in order to put, as I mentioned, the Archduke Charles on the Spanish throne rather than the French Philip. Oh, I suppose I better make it clear, by the way. Archduke Charles was, of course, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor at the time of the beginning of the war, but he was the brother, since Leopold of Austria died, he was then the brother of the Holy Roman Empire for the remainder of the war. So, yeah, sorry about the confusion there. The French primary allies were actually a Holy Roman vassal, namely the House of Wittelsbach and the Dukes of Bavaria. And this would, in the context of the Battle of Blenheim, become very important, because it meant that the French armies through Bavaria basically had direct access to the Holy Roman Emperor core lands, particularly the Habsburg core lands, and the French were to use this to try to make a knockout blow of the empire very early in the war. And it is in this context that the Battle of Blenheim was being fought, but I'll get back to that when we actually get to in that particular video. Anyway, the war in the beginning did go France's way. Then for a long time it most certainly didn't go France's way, and then after more than a decade it sort of ended in a major stalemate, and eventually it was decided that since the Dutch Republic had achieved their sort of immediate goals of pushing France back in a buffer zone so they couldn't just immediately invade, the British had had a major policy change as Queen Anne, who had come to the throne, had decided to repudiate the war tactics and embrace the peace party at home. And because Archduke Charles' brother died, and he then became Holy Roman Empire, Holy Roman Emperor, which meant that no one was really interested in having the Spanish Empire join the Holy Roman Empire either. The war eventually ended with a peace treaty wherein Philip became King of Spain but renounced all holds he or his descendants would have to the throne of France, and most of the areas that Spain had controlled in Europe, such as areas of Italy and the Spanish Netherlands, were transferred to the Habsburg, while the Spanish maintained their large colonial empire, and the war ended there. All in all, a typical war for land and influence of, shall we say, pre-modern Europe. It is, however, very interesting for the developing military tactics and diplomatic ways that had to be employed during the war to keep the various alliances going. So it's certainly worth a study. However, we're going to be looking eventually at some of the battles that took place there, and as I said today, in the second video I'll put up, we will be looking at probably the most, well, famous battle of that particular war, namely the Battle of Blenheim, where the Duke of Marlborough and his Dutch allies raced against time to prevent the combined French-Bavarian armies in taking control of the Habsburg core lands and knocking the Holy Roman Empire out of the war. So, yeah, look forward to that. Well, that was it. A very quick and dirty overview of the War of Spanish Succession. If you're interested or need to know more, I would suggest you go read up on it. There are several sources around that gives a much better overview than this. Was basically just a why was they fighting at all? What was this war about? Why was the various people allied against each other? So, well, I hope you enjoyed this, as I said, very quick, very dirty overview of the reasons for the War of Spanish Succession and why Blenheim itself became so important. So yeah, on to that.